here who don't know Dan, you've probably heard of him, but you might not know him. Just a brief bio on Dan Dixey. He was born and bred in Marblehead. He is an 11th generation Marbleheader. He has, for the past 30 years, has been collecting Marblehead memorabilia. He has a collection of photos, glass slides, books, maps, you name it. He has amassed a huge collection of Marblehead history. He once said that his mom used to say to him in the 1700s, his family used to welcome people to Marblehead. And when he said that, I thought that is really, really cool. So you go back so many years in this beautiful town. Which brings me forward to our museum. And our mission here at the museum is to preserve, promote, and protect Marblehead history. We are also fortunate to either live or be part of this beautiful historic town. It's truly a gem. And in order to move forward in a beautiful town like this and to preserve and protect and promote our history, we have to take a look back. And when we take a look back in history, we get to see some of the people, the places, and the things that formed this town, that made this town the town it is today, and why we celebrate its history. So it is with that tonight, I have the special honor to welcome our lecturer, Dan Dixey. This is going to be an amazing show, so for you to enjoy.
Well, thank you, Patty, and thank you all for coming tonight so I can share my photos with you in this nice historic old building. You can see, any questions or comments, please wait till when we break it, when it's over, and have the refreshments so that I can keep it moving along. And before I get into the photos, just give you a quick summary of my background and how I get into my collection. And it was about 30 years ago when I was living up on 2 Kenneth Road, and my wife and I used to walk around town all the time. I would see the tour buses parked outside Abbott Hall and coming and going, and I'd always comment that these people probably left Marblehead knowing more about it than I did, and they've only been here an hour and I was born here. So for Christmas, my wife got me this book, and so I started reading it, and I saw the name Dixey appear over and over in it, so so I decided this would be fun to work on the family tree and see if I was possibly related to the Dixeys in that book. So I started my research, and because I knew I was born at the new Mary Alley Hospital in 1953, just a few months after it had opened, and my parents were Vincent and Mary Dixey, and I grew up at 6 Reed Street. Now my grandparents lived at 14 Nicholson Hill. My father was actually born in this house. My grandfather was William Edward Dixey, and he worked for the railroad in town. I found interesting fact that when I was doing my research, I found out the day that my grandfather died was the exact same day and year that my wife and my brother's wife were born. So, and that's me with my older siblings. Michael's here tonight. You get points if you can pick him out of the crowd. Now, my great-grandfather lived at 5 Middle Street, right over here. He was a shoemaker in town. He was in the Spanish-American War in 1898. His father was also William that lived there, and he was a shoemaker. Then went back to Captain Edward Dixey down on Circle Street. At 21 Circle Street is where the Dixeys lived, right next to the Skipper Ryerson house. And then went back a couple more generations to a John Dixey on Orange Street, a house set back at number 32. And that John, this is a page out of the Marblehead Sea Captain's book. This was my 5th great-grandfather, John Dixey, and he was, you can see he was captured by the English and actually was imprisoned for almost 3 years over in England. And after he returned, he became a selectman in town from 1793 to 1796. Then went back a couple more generations of Johns, and then I went to my 8th great-grandfather was Samuel Dixey, and his father was Thomas Dixey, and this is Naugus Head. This is a map from 1700. Now, so my ninth great-grandfather was Thomas Dixey that ran the ferry. He operated the ferry from the end of Green Street over to Salem. He rode it by hand, you know, every day for over 30 years. And I was doing all this research, living at 2 Kenneth Road right here with my office window overlooking the ferry and this land of my ninth great-grandfather. So I ended up finding out I was an 11th generation born Marbleheader, and needless to say, all the Marblehead history and the photos that you come across doing this got me into collecting. So today, okay, I've got over 60 books and booklets, pamphlets, maps, all Marblehead. I've got close to 1,000 negatives. Most of them are the glass negatives. Photos, slides, postcards, boxes and boxes of paper material. The oldest images I have are in the stereo views and the cabinet cards. And those were popular in the 1870s, 1880s, into the 1890s. And remember, this is before electricity, so this was a form of entertainment. The stereo views had 2 images on it, and when you put it in this viewer, it pulled the 2 together for a 3D image. And it was pretty impressive technology for the day. And I've got about 150 of those. And this was the type, these aren't my cameras, I only wish they were, but these were the type of cameras that we used for those early images. And they were the glass negatives. The film was a piece of glass with a light-sensitive material painted onto it, and that became the film. And they had to be loaded one at a time in the back of these cameras, take their exposure, keep it in a light-proof container, take it out, take it back to the darkroom. Now, the film speeds were very slow, so in old pictures you'll see everybody's like, why are the people so serious? They had to sit for long periods of time to get the exposure, and it's much easier to have a straight face than to try to smile for the exposure. The other thing that it caused is like ghost images. If while the lens is open, if your kids are running down the street or a horse carriage is coming up, you know, it wouldn't be in one place long enough to get the image, so it almost looked like a ghost, or you'd see blurry images, and the buildings would all be clear because they weren't moving. So, and a couple of dates to remember as we see the pictures. Marblehead suffered two major fires. At the 1877 fire, over 70 buildings burned down. It was down in the business section of Pleasant Street around the train depot. The depot is where the National Grand Bank is today. And then in 1888, a second fire with another 50 buildings, all in the same area. So we'll get into the photos with the oldest. These date 1860s, and this is at Crocker Park. Actually, before it was Crocker Park, it was Bardol's Head at the time, looking out towards Skinner's Head. That's where the Mer Hotel would be built, and right now the Glover Landing condominiums are. And notice the lack of trees in that section of town. Now, this was taken from the same place, except looking back, again, almost no trees, and you might notice what's missing. If you looked at this view today, you'd see Abbott Hall right up in here, but this was years before Abbott Hall was built. Now, this was the old Hinckley building, which was right out on the corner of Pleasant and Washington Street. This photo was taken like standing about where the muffin shop is, looking back. There's the townhouse. And this building was removed in 1870, so any photos that I find that have that building in it, at least you know it's from 1870 or earlier. This is also a view looking down Pleasant Street. There's the Hinckley building on the corner, and the Baptist church. And this was built in 1869, so that helped date this picture. And the post office was actually in here for a while before they built the new one up the street on Pleasant Street. And again, this is before electricity. There's no wires and just the dirt roads. This was the old South Church, which is where Tony's Pizza is today. This is School Street and Essex Street. That was built in 1860, and that burned in the 1877 fire. Now, this was the Allerton block, which was where the Osborne's building is, kind of across from the National Grand Bank on Pleasant Street. This is Pleasant Street. School Street would run in behind it. In fact, you can see the South Church steeple in behind there. And this was built in 1871 and burned down in 1877 in the fire. And this was the depot. That was built in 1873. This was actually the second train depot building. The first one was just a very small, simple structure, and this one only lasted a few years because that also got lost in the fire. That's what Fort Sill looked like back then. Not much there, no trees at all, just a little building, a couple little outbuildings. Now this church was on the corner of Watson and Pleasant Street, where the Gut and Feathers Club is in here. And this is taken off, but the building looks pretty much the same down on the bottom. Now this was the Harris Shoe Factory on Elm Street, coming from Bessem Street and onto Elm. I mean, from Sewell Street up to Elm. It would be on the left going up the hill, and the two major fires both stopped just before this building. This was built in 1867, but ended up burning in its own fire in 1894. And the brick boiler house to this was off the back, and that became a house. And this was when the National Grand Bank was in the down on Hooper Street, down at Bank Square, diagonally across from the Lee Mansion, and that was built in 1831 for the bank, and that was one of their first locations. Now this is looking down State Street, standing next to the townhouse. Love the way they dressed. All the boys, men, girls, everybody always wore hats. They were always dressed up. They were wearing jackets. All the girls and women had long dresses. I like the wooden wheelbarrow with a couple of kids playing in it. Now this is looking down from Abbott Hall, looking down Washington Street. Here's the Lee Mansion. And this is an example of the ghost images. This was a horse and carriage coming up the street, and this was, but they were moving, so they almost didn't even appear in it. Now this is on Washington Street, obviously looking to where we're sitting right now. And this was still before electricity, and you can see the trolley tracks. The trolley went all the way down to Franklin Street, and it was horse-drawn trolley. Now there's a lot in this picture. This is May of 1876, and there's a crowd in the street down. This is Stan in the Warwick Theater, would have been over in this area. And all the people in the street, they were dedicating the Mugford Monument at the intersections of Essex and Pleasant. And you can just see the top of that fancy depot. And this was the big Allerton building. School Street would run across in there. And there's a saloon over here on the right, and this is the Marblehead Hotel. There's the gas lanterns. And it was in the back of this building, just about a year after this photo was taken. It was a building in the back of this where that 1877 fire started. And after the fire, this is what it looked like in the downtown area. This photo is taken from Nicholson Hill, so this would be Essex Street, Pleasant Street. The depot would have been here. There's a train there, but there's no depot to go to. That big Allerton block was over here. So they had to rebuild that whole section. Then you get up into the 1880s. Now Abbott Hall's there, so that starts to appear in some of the pictures. And this is looking up Washington Street. Had J.C. Graves had a tea and coffee shop over here on the right, and all dirt roads, still the gas lamps. Now this was Keating's boatyard down off of Lee Street. It was John Keating was a boat builder, and he ran the yard. Now this was 1881 when they started rebuilding after that first fire. You see the brick firehouse. This was that Allerton building. They hadn't rebuilt it yet. All that's left was the foundation and the steps. And Henry Simons had a hardware store in here. And this was the 4th of July in 1884. Now they used to decorate, all the buildings would decorate, they'd have big parades all the time. Actually the Mugford building was only 4 years old when this photo was taken. It was built in 1880. And the women with their long dresses and a couple of, whoops. And this was also the 4th of July, 1884, the townhouse where we are now. And notice these buildings down here had a half a dozen steps going up into them, but the road's been built up over the years so that some of those are just a couple of steps to get in them now. Now this is looking from School Street, looking up Pleasant. The Village Plaza would be up in there. Dr. Dretler's house, when it was still standing. The Warwick would be over in here. And there was the Boston Branch Groceries, and this was a shoe factory in here. And that's the depot that was built in 1878 after the 1877 fire. This was the one they put up that lasted 10 years before this one burned down. And this is back, looking further up on Pleasant Street, looking back, there's that Mugford Monument. Then this was the second Allerton block. They rebuilt that big, massive building. You can see the top of the depot there. School Street would cross in here. And Starbucks is over here now. And then December '88, there was a fire, and that's what happened to that area. And when the smoke cleared, that's what it looked like. This is looking from back, looking out to Pleasant Street's out here. That's Nicholson Hill. This is on the corner of Washington and Essex, where Chet's video. You can see the firehouse. Then we got, this is 1896 was the first Adams house. It was actually Adams and stone. A little lunch room, and you can see the little deck here, the women sitting out there having their lunch. This is right on the harbor. This is down by Fort Beach, down by Fort Sill. I love the way they dress, the wooden barrels. Now we're getting into these images. These next ones are from Fred Lichman. Was a real important photographer in town. He started his business in 1898 down State Street. So a lot of the glass negatives I have came from him. Now this is Fort Sill, the last time it was manned as a fort during the Spanish-American War in 1898. And there was a group, Company C from Chelsea was stationed up there, and that's probably some of those guys in their uniforms. This was probably the Marbleheaders that were stationed up there. But they do have their rifles neatly stacked in the tent. Now this is Darling Street, looking up toward, this is 1898 as well, looking up Ralph Corey's in that building, so that's Washington Street out there. You had the Aiken Brothers lunch, was later with Lockerbie's. Now this is a rare 1898 view with detail in the clouds. They just didn't usually get the exposures to get it, but this was before, this is where the Mer Hotel would be built. That's Skinner's Head again. Now this, girls, this was right in front of Lichman's studio on State Street. And I mean, I'm sure he composed, he put the people there, but the women with their dresses, and they may have gotten dressed up a little bit for these, but they did all dress up back in those days. Now this is not the Wizard of Oz. This was also 1898, and it was Alice Nickerson, Linda Chapman, and Cora Lee Mason. Now, Fred Lichman, the photographer, married Cora Lee 4 years after this photo. They got married in 1902. So she appears in a lot of the photos. Her family, you have to remember, photography was pretty expensive for somebody to have photos done back then with the big glass negatives and the cameras required. So I guess it helped being related to the photographer. Now this was the causeway looking towards the neck. After November 26th and 27th, 1898, there was, they called it the Portland Gale, because at this same storm there was a steamship, the SS Portland, that left Boston heading for Portland, Maine, and went down with 192 people on it. And that's what the causeway looked like. This is Harry Brown and his friends. Now this was a parade in 1899 for the Spanish-American War soldiers. You can see the cannon on there. And this is Pleasant and Washington Street up by the Three Cods over here, Dills, you know, in that area. In fact, the photographer was probably standing on the roof of Hutchie's Chips when he took this. Hutchie's started in 1890, so they would have been there. And a little bit of a traffic jam with the waiting for the parade to go by. And what I like in this, here's another photographer up there with his box camera on the roof taking pictures of the parade. Now this is 1901, officers Eustace and Brown up at Crocker Park. And that was the police uniforms in those days. This was, you can't see much of the hand tub at the Neptune in 1902 on Elm Street. You just barely see the handle. These guys are all sitting on it, but and I imagine they were shooting down that direction with the other crowd. But the way, again, all the boys with their jackets and a lot of them with knickers, hats. They were always dressed up, and this was probably the middle of summer. Now this is 1903, 4th of July, and that's the Greater Block. That's where the Hinckley building used to be, and the Greater Block was built in 1885, and it was all decorated up. And when I posted this online, I says, I wonder if anyone will notice if I colorize that flag. So I put some color and posted it, and I think the only ones that noticed were these people here. They look like they're looking at it. Now this was a harbor view around 1902, 1903. You could just see the lighthouse buried in the mast there. It's kind of camouflage, but looking into the harbor. And it's 1906 at Crocker Park. Again, looking out, you can see the lighthouse here. And you can see these women were moving. You can tell they had the long dresses, but the blurry, and the other ones that were still. They probably had the umbrellas to stay out of the sun. In the middle of summer, they were all dressed up like that. And there's the Mer Hotel. This was a few years after it was built. That was a pretty popular place in its day. And of course, when that was torn down, the Glover Landing condominiums are there now. For any of you postcard collectors, a lot of postcards were made from this negative. They're both single cards and some of the double cards that you open up, they just cropped it so that it was a double wide, and they use this image. Now this is 1908 on Franklin Street. You're starting to see electricity in town, so there's wires and telephone poles starting to show up. But you can see the trolley tracks here coming up the street. The Franklin Street Fire Station was over in here. Where this wagon is, one of the water pumps around town was across the street there, and they used to keep a barrel next to it, keep it full for the horses. And that's who was living in these houses when this photo was taken. There's still some shoemakers in town. William Hammond was the driver for the hose wagon, so all he had to do was walk down the street to go to work. And Joseph Homan's house was in there. Now this was 1914, I believe, in March, the Chestnut and Central Street, the drainage system kind of backed up, and after some rain, it got flooded. So any of you that live on Chestnut or Central, if you get a little water in your basement in a rainstorm, consider yourself lucky. Atlantic Avenue would be out there, Seaside would be in behind those buildings there. Now this was I'll get that off there first. A baseball game here. This was before the grandstand was built. They just had the backstop. This was the old Catholic church, which was up at Prospect and Roland Streets, right where the apartment building is now. That was the original location of the Catholic church. In 1928, they built the new one down here, the Star of the Sea. So this is Atlantic Ave. When you zoom in on it, you can see there's a combination of horse-drawn wagons and motor vehicles starting to appear in the streets. And again, the crowd lined up, and look at all the women with their long dresses, and everybody dressed up for a baseball game. And the date was on that, so I looked out, went up to the library and found the old microfilm of the newspaper, and Marblehead lost that game, but I got the lineup and everybody that was on the team. Now this wasn't a Lichman, this was a glass negative. I have several from, I'm not even sure who the photographer was, but it was marked airplane over harbor. And what it was photoshopping 100 years before its time, because the photographer took the negative and he scratched and drew this plane in the sky. Then when you took it in a dark room and printed it, what was scratched away ends up becoming black and looked like a plane. So I don't know if he sold any of these as authentic or not, but he didn't mark the negative as a fake. He just marked it airplane over harbor. And this was just another parade day. People were starting to line up, and this is this was after Litchman's had moved to next to the Lee Mansion. Lee Mansion's right here. This is Washington Street. What I like about this one is the policeman walking the beat, and this little boy walking right next to him, and again, all dressed up with the hat and the knickers. There's Philip Tucker from Tucker's Wharf, the one that started the transportation company. And little car accident. This is on Ocean Ave. You can actually see that old Catholic church in the background, and probably distracted driving. There's World War I. Some of the soldiers, before they shipped out, they gathered right on the steps right outside where we're sitting here. And that was the Liberty Bond poster workers. They went around town putting posters up for selling the bonds. But this is on School Street. Tony's Pizza would be inside this curb here, and that's Slee's at 8 School Street. Now this picture kind of shows the power of the internet. This negative was strictly marked day and sun and no other information. Now, based on the type of negatives, I usually have a pretty good date range for when they are, but I posted it online, and people kind of started asking questions. And there's Stephen Hall, who's I consider one of the best history detectives around, started asking some questions. So I zoomed in on the newspaper, and I actually could see the headline. I couldn't get the date, but we saw the headline, which was in 3 newspapers, 2 the last day of May of 1918 and June 1st. So we dated this to the first week in June. Also found there was a Fred Day who was a summer resident over the neck, and he had a 2.5-year-old son, Frederick Jr. So they found all that information, figured this was probably his father, and they came up with his name. Even found the death record for the baby, who actually died 7 years ago at age 91. Now there's the Osborne store, I guess the meat and vegetable counter, and that was Harold Russell and Frank, the founder of the store, and Jack Davis and Emerson Clark, who was Juggo's father. And this is that's 1919. And that was the store window, the canned goods. And I assumed this negative wasn't marked at all, and I assumed it was Osborne's, but I wasn't positive. So I looked at the reflection in the window, and I have photos of that building, which is next to the depot on Pleasant Street, so it confirmed that that was actually Osborne's store. This was 1919, Stearns and McKay yard. That's where Graves moved thereafter. You can just see this building's on the corner. This is State Street coming in, and the wharf area used to be different. Now this one was just marked children opposite 89 Front Street, and I don't know if it was from some school or some group they put together, but this shows the kids knew how the film worked. Now this kid here was shaking his head back and forth, so it'd have no face. And these 2 kids laughing at him because they knew what he was doing. And this kid's looking over, laughing at the kid sticking his tongue out. I guess boys will be boys. Now that's the, I think it was a 1923 football team. They used to play the games down at Seaside Park. There's the grandstand. And other than the helmets, that's the full uniforms that they wore. You can actually see the helmets that they had. They're sitting on the ground. They were just very thin leather helmets. That was that, and what they're wearing was their protection. And that was a Hathaway. It was marked Hathaway truck. It actually says Purington was the maker of it, and just an old, I think, a chain-driven vehicle. And this is in front of the National Grand Bank down, at Bank Square. Darling Street would be in there, and this is Lily Bridge's restaurant was on the corner there. And I guess it was parking on the street then because there's some cars lined up on that section. Now this was an undated negative, but it was the for the Burgess Airplane Factory, which actually put out a lot of, during the war, they built a lot of planes, and this was the wing workers float. These people here carrying little planes on sticks in the parade. And again, I love the kids following the parade, and they're holding the little sister's hand, and the knickers and the hats. And that's on Elm Street, like Creasy Street. It's probably where they're crossing. And that was a baseball group, either down at Green Street or down at Seaside. You can see the old five-fingered gloves, the big catcher's mitt, and the wooden bats. Now this was like Goodwin movers moving a boat at the freight yard. This is Bessem Street looking up. And the tracks were down in a little dip in the road there. Gilbert and Cole would be over in this section. But there was a track that came in along Bessem where they could put the cars to load them and unload them. So he was probably moving this boat to put it onto a train to take it someplace. You can see up in the back towards Highland Terrace. This is the top of the Grader House on Highland Terrace. Now the house that we lived in on Reed Street, when we moved up to Reed Street in the late 1950s, this little building here was behind the house, and our parents wouldn't let us go in it. It was an old shoemaker shop. And it still had some tools and some of the little metal shapes that they used for cutting the leather. But we ended up tearing that down, and I didn't save any of the items in there because I wasn't supposed to go in. And here's Lichman. That's Fred Lichman, the photographer, and I guess some of his workers. This is the location where Lichman's actually still is today on Washington Street, next to the Lee Mansion. And the Corinthian Yacht Club. There was some damage on this negative. That's with the black, but there was some workers. Not sure what they were doing or working, but it was a nice shot of it from the water. Now this was Devereux Beach. It's finally the first picture that you'll see that everybody wasn't wearing a hat, but they all wore tops. All of the men and boys on this beach had shirts on. None of them had the tops off. So. Now, this was an interesting one, and it was Blaney and Adams reversible heel Marblehead Mass it said on it, and I guess he was demonstrating the way the heel went onto a shoe, and like the tattoo on the guy's hand. That was the John S. Martin coal truck, and they used to deliver. A lot of the houses were heated with coal stoves, so they had the bags of coal that they take around town to deliver. You see the driver was moving, so he's kind of a little blurry and almost not in the picture, but I'm sure it was a nice smooth ride with these solid tires, and that's also a chain driven. There's a chain there, and this is on Cliff Street. This was a broken negative, but it was a good shot of the Yoko's hand tub on Middle Street. That would be Washington Street in the background. Now this one, I'm not sure what basement this was taken in, but it says Fresh Air Taxi Cab Company of America Incorporated. It's deliberately spelt wrong, and backwards letters, and a scary clown, and there's so much wrong with this picture I'm not even going to talk about it. This was some of the girls' basketball team, 1930, on the steps of the high school. Now Goodwin movers still moving boats, but now they have a motorized vehicle to do it. Now this was Love's filling station, later the location of Phil's Mobile, which I think was the last gas station in town. And this was another gas station up at Pleasant Street and Vine Street. I'm not sure who ran this station. Later on, Armin Barassa had his station there. You can see the trolley tracks on Pleasant Street. Now this was Village Street. Standing about where the driveway goes in, the driveway going into the school is probably about here. And that's when there were two tanks up there. Of course, now there's just one tank, but you can see there were no houses on the right-hand side and not too many till you get down there. I think the negative, I don't think the pole was that bent. I think between this screen and the negative. Now, there was a photographer from out of town that came in 1938 and took a series of photos, and I ended up with all of his negatives. So this is down on Front Street. Darling Street comes in here, and there was a little little restaurant, and you can't read it on the screen, but it said, special roast beef dinners, 75 cents on Sundays. And this 1938, kind of down at the end of State Street, looking up Front Street. The landing would be over in here where the Southwester is. I love the old cars and the barrels, and looking at some of those small things in the picture. That was William Lemon Drugstore. If you look out the window over there, you'll see it. That's right across the street, the brick building. And there's still trolley tracks on the side of the road, could be seen. So it's still 1938, Cleopatra's Barge, some other boats sailing out of the harbor. And the ferry down at Tucker's Wharf, the sign was out on Front Street. And I actually have several of the old, I have this ticket, and I'm not sure, it didn't have a price on it. It looked like a pretty fancy ticket. It was numbered. It has a 5 over here. I don't know if that's when it was a nickel or not, but I have that. And there's the Delta coming in. Looks like it's got a pretty good crew on it. The sign says, bathing, fishing from landing is prohibited. And the Graveyard, 1938. And he named a boat after his 3 kids, combinations of their names. And there's the townhouse. I've got so many photos of this view, and the buildings all look about the same, but the cars and the road and the wires and dirt roads, and you can see the changes over the years. And of course, sailboat racing at Redd's Pond, 1938. And the yacht club. Yeah, the Eastern Yacht Club, sorry. Now this house was on Pleasant Street up towards Smith. I think it's like 267 or so, and I always thought as a kid that this was a haunted house. They tore it down in the 1960s. In fact, if you go there today, these steps are still there, the wall's still there, and I believe the foundation's there, but it's just overgrown with trees. And then across the street was the Pleasant Manor Inn. Now it's the Marblehead Inn, and it's a lot clearer around it. And trolley tracks in the road. Now this is 1947. It's funny, there was a baseball game that day, so there's people sitting in the bleachers, and the pitcher's out there warming up, kind of oblivious to the fact there's a helicopter and a crowd out in the outfield. But it was Lucille Ball came into Marblehead. And that's Selectman Lester Marsh and Charlie Woodfin was the policeman. And they were escorting her out, and there was a lot of theater in Marblehead back then. They had things at the high school, they had the Lyceum Theater, and there were a few other places that had plays. So Lucy was in town for that. Ironically, the same year, Vivian Vance was appearing in Marblehead, and of course in the I Love Lucy show, she was Ethel, and this was 4 years before the I Love Lucy show was even on air. So maybe they met in Marblehead. This was a parade on Atlantic Avenue in front of Shub's. That's where CVS is today. The liquor store was on the side of it over here. And another one of Marblehead's gas stations. For years, Bruce Swayze had his station out of there, delivered oil around town. Then Hurricane Carol, those are some boats washed up in front of the Mer Hotel. I think it was 1954. I actually put some of the dates to help me cheat on the bottom, but they got cut off, so I have to wing it. And there's Harry Wilkinson, 1957, sitting in front of the old Boston Yacht Club. Used to be down here at down at the end of State Street. The driftwood would be over here on the right. And this is taken from that Boston Yacht Club looking back, and you can see how the wharf area they used to launch boats in here, and the kids used to go in there swimming. They filled that in the 1970s, and of course now it's out to here, but this is all filled in, and the parking comes looping through. This is Front Street, and the landing's over here. State Street comes in the bottom there. And there's the Kelpie, 1950 something. Can't see the date on there, but I'm not so sure this oily sludge is supposed to be coming out of it like that into the harbor. And the Anchor restaurant was kind of diagonally across from the Driftwood down on Front Street. And you can see this was the Delta being launched, I think 1963. Here's the Driftwood. There's that Anchor restaurant. A liquor store. There was a liquor store for many years on the corner of State. This is State Street coming in. And I love the old cars. And Lynn Marine Supply was a busy place for many years down there on Front Street. And there's Joe Walker, 1964, down at the wharf. They painted that building. I think the restaurant was no longer in there. Something else went in there, but it was still before they filled in this section. Then 1965, there was a barn that Link Hawks was going to take and move to the other side. So his plan was to do it in the winter when it was frozen and drag it across the ice. So he started to do that until he heard the cracking and figured it might not be the best idea. So he put it back and waited till spring, and he built this fancy floaty device, and he floated across. So he moved it to the other side. I'm sure that's an OSHA-approved moving device too. And this was a fire, ladder 2, 1965. I'm not sure what fire or who the fireman was, but it was kind of a nice action slide that it had. And there's the Driftwood, 1968. They must have closed for the winter because there was a sign on the door that said reopening in March. And this was taken New Year's Day. And that's what the Barnacle used to look like. This is from a postcard I have. And of course, the Barnacle's in the same location now. This was this stone building was the Adams House restaurant, and that's where the big apartment building is now. And Engine 1 and Engine 3, I think this was 1970 down, and this is where the landing is. This was Belo's, the lobster house. Then we had Brown's Bakery. This was at Marblehead Real Estate. Lamo had his little shoe repair shop in here. I think it was House of Pizza here then, but that's where Abby Mays used to be. They had the best rock candy around. Then this was Lenny Frost's Shell Station. You can see Brown's in the background there. Must have been doing something with the tank, so they had the fire department standing by. Then we've got Dills and North Shore News. To the left, this is where the 3-cod is today. I think they take up the entire space. You had Mrs. Roberts' sandwich shop over here, and then Hutchie's on that side. Then you got Link Hawks in 1982, and he used to parade his bull around town. He'd take it into some of the establishments, and I heard that he even took it into the landing and went to the bar because there was some old ordinance on the books that said you could bring your bulls into bars or something, so even in there. So. And I'll end it with my version of Photoshop. This is the 1906 view we saw earlier. These firework pictures I actually took in Maine in 2013 and just photoshopped them into the picture. So that's it. And And I'm no longer intimidated by the tour buses in town.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. Dan being a very humble person, he wouldn't tell you this, but I can. The amount of work and time and effort that goes into putting something like this together is just... All our hearts, we thank you, and For those of you who go online and go on Facebook, Dan has a very famous site, the historic images that anyone can become a member of and get to see. He posts pictures all the time. He writes little bios on different things, and he has, I think, what we call rock star status on Facebook. I think he has 10 or 12,000 followers, as you can imagine. So
Close enough.
we want to see some of his photos, and we'd love to have him back again sometime for the museum. And again, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I also wanted to say, now that this has concluded, we're going to serve some Joe Progress and cider. I want to say hello to Dan, and we have some 5 original photographs that you can order copies of if you should wish to. They make great Christmas presents or just, historic pictures. There's 5 of them available, and you can order them if you want. And again, thank you all for coming, and again, thank you, Dan, for a fabulous